Thanks for the kind introduction, Sujith. Today, I'm going to give a talk on APIs and working back from the customer. These are probably ideas you've heard of before. I'm just going to share my sort of contextual experience leading up to the moment when I became obsessed with APIs, which is about somewhere in the 2015 timeframe. So how did we get here? It's really a complex world out there, and it's been quite a journey from green screens to mainframe computing, green screens and mainframe computing to like multiple cloud providers and all of the technology contained within those. I'm a consultant now. I'm a lead consultant with Impact Makers here in Richmond. And most of my experience is in the financial services space. And in the financial services space, we've been working with mainframes for many years. And today, the mainframes are still there, but to really get to the mainframe interfaces is like doing an archaeological dig. It's really like you have to go through RESTful services and SOAP, XML services, all the way back to the various interfaces into the mainframe. I'll plan to talk a bit about some of these layers and why the best thinking of certain errors may be constraining us today. Then I'll go into different ways of operating and designing teams in the new world of cloud computing. That's a lot of what I do today is really like helping organizations to transform. And it's really hard because most organizations are very much entrenched in supporting what's in place today. So how did I get here? So I started, for those who are in the little meet and greet before the presentation, I grew up in Maryland. I went to UMBC, which is like a computer science commuter school, I would call it. And so I worked my way through college and then eventually landed at a software company in Baltimore, Maryland called Training Server. Training Server eventually became Saba, and Saba, I think, was recently purchased by Cornerstone On Demand. And those are like some of the biggest learning management systems on the market today. And so I sort of like learned the trade. I started out as a developer and database engineer, and then eventually became a sales engineer because they said I was a good communicator. Then I did a bit of consulting outside of software just to make sure my skills translated and that I was doing the right type of work. But after many years of traveling almost 100%, I decided it was time to hunker down somewhere. And that's when I landed at Capital One. And my last title at Capital One was Solution Architect, but I went through sort of a litany of different roles at Capital One. And then in 2019, I left Capital One and I was a senior product manager at West Creek Financial, which is a local small financial services startup here in Richmond. But after that, I've been doing consulting work at Impact Makers for a couple of years, basically. So this learning management system that I worked on back in 2000, it was an enterprise software system where organizations like Citigroup, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin coordinated their training for their entire enterprises. And so it's pretty interesting work at the beginning. Somewhere around 2000 or somewhere thereafter, they decided that they needed a web application that could plug into the legacy system. That was sort of the time of the dot-com bubble coming to a head. for those of you who remember. I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions. I'm going to check the chat also. Okay, we got some Capital One alum out there. Shout out. Okay. So fast forward to 2008. I started at Capital One on the RTM platform as a business systems analyst. That was my first title. But I played many other roles, including integration BSA, tech lead, engineer, and finally solution architect. The joy of middleware. Like this sounds like a joke, but I really actually did love it because I basically got to learn how all the different channels operated at Capital One. When I landed there wasn't much there. There was, at the time, we called it VRU, Voice Response Unit. I'm sure Sajith remembers this. We had the agent channel and web, similar to training server. Web was kind of new. Web 2.0 and like robust web applications were relatively new. Things were much simpler. The integration and the functionality was relatively basic compared to what we do today. And so the next two slides almost happened simultaneously. We got into this big agile transformation, like everybody across Capital One. The company went all in on agile transformation, and job families changed. They did away with the BSA job family. Capital One introduced the product owner and product manager roles. I was impacted by the transformation and became a software engineer again for a season. Almost simultaneously, and I kind of missed the beginning of the transformation. I joined, so from the middleware platform, I joined the mobile banking platform. For some of you may know that mobile 1.0 at Capital One was actually an app that screen scraped the enterprise online servicing application at Capital One. And we used a product called Coney to enable that. And it was very basic, but you could download an app and you could check your balance and do some basic things. So we had an app in market. But I joined the mobile team to help launch mobile 2.0 with some pretty cool features like rewards redemption. And basically, we were trying to deliver an application that was reusing the services or the API. I won't go as far as call them APIs, but the services that powered the enterprise online servicing platform. But what we came to find out was that those services were very much tightly coupled with the web channel, and they solved a lot of nuanced problems that were specific to the web channel. A few of the services we are able to reuse, but not too many. So we ended up building our own services primarily. Part of my job at the time was to audit log these services that we built for mobile. And it was my first foray into data engineering. At the time, I hated it, but today I'm really grateful that I learned that. Again, I'm going to pause. I don't want to go too fast or miss questions. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for the translation, Sujith. Any questions? Okay, so the culmination of my tenure at on the mobile platform was I helped to lead the effort to deliver the remote deposit capture program where you take a picture of your check. We were kind of late to market with that product, and it was really cool. Worked with some really great engineers to deliver that, and it was like a phenomenal experience because I actually helped to design the APIs from the ground up, worked through all kinds of challenging problems, not the least of which was that 3G was the wireless protocol of the day. And one of the engineers built what was called the message translation layer. The idea was we didn't want to use SOAP interfaces to send a check image over a 3G network. And so we wanted to sort of like streamline the packets that we were sending over 3G. And so message translation layer was basically translating SOAP XML into JSON, RESTful JSON APIs. And that was that. But what happened when the message translate at the end of that project, what happened was we created chassis, and I was product manager or owner for a team called Restafarians. And it was Capital One's API platform. Again, really great experience. This was like for me, it was like the first foray into API platforms. And this is probably around 2015, 2016. Our team was ingested into sort of like the central enterprise team, and Chassis was born. And the idea was build a platform that others could consume. It would enable other teams to actually use the platform to deliver and eliminate the need on centralized resources. I'm going to pause again to see if there's questions. Okay.
There is a question about what is an API versus writing an application for a mainframe.
Oh, okay. So writing an application for a mainframe. So mainframes, I mean, I guess technically interfaces, application interfaces, the interfaces into a mainframe could be considered an API. And so I would say the API sort of economy, and if you ask Jeff Bezos, it wouldn't matter, provided you could allow others to interface with you. But I think there's some nuances we could talk about as the idea of APIs mature. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, just my perspective on that is, yeah, I think there's a general like term API. It just basically means it's an application programming interface, right? So
right.
It can be interfaced to anything that you are interacting with from a system perspective, be it a mainframe or even like a kind of a device driver or whatnot, right?
Right, exactly.
But in general, though, or like in a more common terminology, when they talk about APIs, they're talking specifically about a REST-based JSON API,
exactly,
which is over HTTP. That's typically what they mean when they say API.
Exactly, and even now, I'm starting to hear and read more about like serverless APIs and things of that nature. It's kind of an interesting concept, but
yeah. So there's a question about REST-based. So the REST we are talking about is the representational state transfer, I guess. So
right.
it's REST. That's what we are talking about.
Right.
And there's a question about what is an ESB. So an ESB is acronym for Enterprise Service Bus.
Right.
So I know that if you scroll up a little bit, I'm sure I'm butchering this name, but Maru Wan has he makes a mention of middleware as a class of patterns and architectures, and ESB is an implementation or one of the patterns that can be used to implement that. And in a more in a more common scenario, ESB is actually a product suite that is purchased from one of the big firms like
exactly
Software AG or Tibco or like whoever provides a set of tools that you can use as your ESB layer.
Right.
Sorry, I'm yeah. I mean, these are some general questions here, but
Cool. Yeah. No, it's all good.
All right.
All right, I'm going to keep going.
Sure. Thanks.
All right, so yeah, Rastafarians is a hilarious name. Andy Pemberton gets credit for that name. I don't know if any of you guys have you worked with him, but he was on the mobile team and we named that platform. So I became a product owner, and then we built certain things into the platform to enable teams to streamline the API development and define best practices. Like this is a whole nother rabbit hole, but it was sort of like the beginning of a foray into becoming like more of a platform company.
Yeah, they can't hear me. Oh, they heard you though.
Okay, taking the show on the road. So after time on the chassis API platform, we did something called federation, where I started the first API team in Card, and sort of like allowed teams within the lines of business to start building their own APIs. Funny comment here, so at least I thought it was funny, sort of like giving power back to the states, but not quite, because the challenge was like whenever you had centralized delivery teams in IT and you had lines of business wanting to build more and faster, at least this is how it was at Capital One, there was always sort of like this notion or perception that the centralized teams were too slow and didn't understand the domain of the business, and et cetera, et cetera. So the idea was to create a platform and enable teams within the lines of business to deliver their own APIs on the platform. And so I helped launch that team within Card. It was a good experience, and our business partners were really happy with what we did. I'm actually gonna, oh wow, Rob Tompkins is a good friend of mine. That's interesting. I'm sad I missed that. So, all right, Conway's Law and friction with API strategy. So I'm sure some of you or many of you have heard of Conway's Law. The idea is any organization that designs a system, broadly defined, will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. And so part of the challenge, at least at the time at Capital One, was each channel was almost like a separate entity. And so mobile, web, phone channel, agent channel, and then even the layers behind, like the middleware and then the core, all operated separately and had different management chains. And so APIs were kind of cross-cutting. To properly implement APIs meant you had to sort of like start to think about the customer and start to think about what the customer wanted and delivering APIs that aligned with that need as opposed to what the channel wanted. And also APIs were artifacts that did not belong to anyone at the time. Yeah, although they were key to building new features at scale, the organization, based on how it was structured, didn't value them at the time because they were incentivized to deliver within their own channel. So there's no real incentive to help your friend across the aisle who was on, say, mobile when you're on the web to deliver some feature that was maybe, the same feature across different channels. There's no incentive to help them. And so the organization's structure precluded the organization reaching the value of the APIs at the time. And then accountable executives had to be assigned to own APIs. The APIs were not sexy yet. And so APIs are becoming more and more sexy nowadays because of the demands. Like there's so many channels and there's so many needs. People are starting to see the value of it. Yeah, and I kind of mentioned this already. So at the time, building new features was what business partners wanted. And so business partners were assigned at the channel level. and they just wanted a new feature within a channel. So if you were a product manager, you were like a web product manager, didn't really care about what mobile delivered. So what ended up happening was a lot of redundant services were built. And so anyway, getting back to what I'm talking about here, they weren't concerned about the cost of tech debt or, you know, fragile monolithic architectures. Yet they were frustrated with the time it took to deliver new features. And so that was kind of the dilemma of the day. Like, we want more, we want faster, we want more, we want faster, but they didn't want to take on the investment that would enable those things to move faster. All right, I'm gonna, cool, thank you for the topic. I mean, for the comment. Okay. Each channel, harkening back to the Conways Law reference, each channel had its own communication structure and hierarchy. And I kind of talked this through already. API and services were duplicated across channels. Like I specifically went in, I can give you 2 examples. I won't say anything that's proprietary, but we went from one channel to the next to look at identical features, and we found out that the business rules were different, like significantly different, and that was due to the silos that were created in channels. And so that was eye-opening to me. I had 2 such moments that are etched in my brain, maybe permanently. And so that was really when I started to get passionate about APIs. And yeah, and so now I'm going to start to get into some of the research I did regarding APIs. Once I started seeing what was happening, at least at Capital One, where I was at the time. Some of the companies and people that have influenced me. Amazon is, you know, I'm a firm believer that Amazon really invented the concept of platform and used APIs to scale massively, maybe better than anybody. But there's some interesting patterns that emerged at Uber and Netflix, which were interesting to me as well. Eric Evans and can you guys hear me? Like, I just got a message. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, gotcha. It said people can see my screen now. I thought maybe it went out for a second.
Yeah, we see your screen too.
Okay, cool. A ton of reading into domain-driven design and trying to understand how things should work and coming up with my own concepts of how they should work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have promoted and maybe even evangelized. Like, what I learned was, like, if you're going to become an API enthusiast, you're almost like an evangelist. People thought I was crazy, but like I was pretty passionate about it. And so what I will say also is, and Sajid probably knows this, for those of you who are in like the consulting world, I'm seeing a ton of demand for these types of ideas right now.
That was easy.
What's that? Was that a question? Okay, I guess somebody wasn't on mute. I'm seeing a ton of demand for these ideas in the marketplace today, and it's driven primarily by the idea that everybody's moving to the cloud and they need ways to scale more efficiently and automation across the stack. And in my mind, APIs are the answer. Okay, so working back from the customer, this is also borderline product management. It's not so much a tech approach, but like as Sue just mentioned at the beginning, this is about like the what and the why, and thinking about, well, who is the customer? What is the customer problem or opportunity? And thinking about the customer benefits. How do you know what customers want or need, and what does the customer experience look like? I first was introduced to all of these ideas when we delivered remote deposit capture. And I would say we did a lot of this pretty well, maybe not to the extent that Amazon does it, but we started thinking through this and we started designing back from the customer. We kept really good analytics on the experience, whether it be not clickstream, but I guess touch data regarding where people went within the app, when people experience friction within the app, and basically we got really good at capturing everything within what we called the audit logs, but it was just basically data engineering for the API. And what I came to find out was that API was like a really good boundary where you found out if the transaction happened or not. I'm not going to spend too much time there, but this is a really important concept that I'm seeing tremendous growth in, mostly in startups. But this kind of thinking is going to be very important in the future. Like, you're going to see more in the way of what does the customer want, hypothesis-driven development, A/B testing, et cetera. I'm sure you guys have done lots of that, but doing it in a structured way is still pretty rare, especially when you're talking about legacy organizations. Domain-driven design, like I'm a big fan of this. I've worked with the architecture group at Capital One for many years, and we used to really butt heads on this. I think the main concept that I've always aligned to is the concept that name things in a way that matches the business domain. Very often I see things that have nothing to do with the naming has nothing to do with the business domain. So when you go to talk to a business person, they have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe some people like it, but like in this world of like, let's move faster, it actually helps to align your partners quicker and get to the right destination quicker. And I'm a big believer, if I take anything from domain-driven design, it's getting the syntax right, getting the syntax so that the business understands what's happening behind the covers. So the idea of microservices architecture has bounced around from time to time at Capital One and other places, but like it was really hard due to sort of like the cross-cutting nature of microservices. I'm not going to get too heavily into the ins and outs of microservices, but if you're talking API strategy, invariably you're going to talk microservices, and some of the so if channels are horizontal structures, then microservices and APIs are vertical structures, which are cross-cutting, and that's really the hardest thing to tackle. Okay, so I don't know how many of you have heard of this quote attributed to Jeff Bezos, but I'm trying not to like read bullet points, but this one I'm going to read because I really think that this is when, if we make a distinction between the modern API and the legacy API, this might be the good sort of milestone where these things really became powerful. Apparently Jeff Bezos wrote an email to all of Amazon at the time. 2002, I think, was the date. All teams henceforth expose their data and functionality through service interfaces. Teams must communicate with each other through these interfaces. There will be no other form of inter-process communication allowed, no direct linking, no direct reads of another's team's data store, no shared memory model, no backdoors whatsoever. The only communication allowed is via service interface calls over the network. It doesn't matter. This is an important distinction. Maybe this answers the previous question. It doesn't matter how, HTTP, Corba, PubSub, custom protocols, doesn't matter. All service interfaces without exception must be designed from the ground up to be externalizable. That is to say, the team must plan and design to be able to expose the interface to developers in the outside world, no exceptions. Anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. Kind of harsh, but that's Bezos. And so I think he saw the value way before anybody. He and others saw the value way before anybody of a good, robust API strategy. Looks like we have some action on the chat. Yeah, he is harsh.
That is how you get to space, right?
Yeah, exactly. It worked. He figured out massive scale through APIs. So if anybody wants to go to space, adopt APIs. Just kidding. All right, cool. These are all cool comments. Yeah, exactly. He's right often enough to have the right to be harsh. Yeah, and so to me, if you ask me, this is the absolute right move. Like the benevolent dictator who saw the vision and locked in at the right time. I have very often wished to find such a leader who would do the same thing across different companies, but I've yet to find one. So I agree.
If I may, Art, on this particular topic, I spent many years doing technology strategy. So moved from strategy back to tech, where my background is, and it's incredible how much people in decision positions, you can call them management, I don't care. Sometimes they're called product management even. It depends on organization, but decision roles that do not hesitate to let the company incur huge losses by taking into account incredible technical debt just because they want to hit deadlines, and they're not ashamed of the lack of basic understanding they have of what their teams are trying to build. And that's shameful for me. And I understand people like Jeff Bezos who doesn't want to lose billions and then destroy the future of his company, saying, I don't want this stupid technical debt. I want you to do good work, do less, but do it well. I mean, building interfaces is, I mean, seriously. I mean, if you've been programming OS, Unix or Linux code in the 70s, everybody was doing interfaces back then. And it was much more complicated. You didn't even have IDEs to do that stuff. You were programming on VIM and Emacs text files. I'm just really allergic to this, and I get really emotional because it's just basic understanding of how to build software products, and it's just annoying to see how much mispractices are around there. If I think if CEOs of companies knew what their managers were doing in terms of decisions, they would all fire them, honestly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that recently I've got 2 engagements where we have senior leadership going all in on APIs. And so I think that maybe at least in financial services, big scale financial services, they're starting to see, like there's a tipping point that I recently read an article, a McKinsey article, where I think we're seeing a tipping point because there's pressure to compete with fintechs. It's either like gobble them up and buy the fintech or figure out how to operate at scale. And now in this world of COVID, it's harder and harder to find employees. And so it's like, how do you scale and automate? This is the way. And so maybe, so in terms of evangelism and being passionate about all the waste, I've been nearly fired many times for going too far because, the places where I worked, the business was in power. And in public companies, very often they think quarter over quarter. And if we go back to the Conways Law comment, like they only care about what's immediately in front of them. And maybe the senior executives didn't realize the value of APIs. So it was really a Conways Law problem as far as I'm concerned. But what I've done is I've found leaders who were really smart and open-minded, and I just would attach myself to them, and I would create presentations and say, hey, massive scale resides here. And in my experience, there's like a 2-year incubation period. So the idea comes out, and it literally, if it's strategic change, at least as far as APIs go, it's like a 2-year incubation period before people bite. And I love the passion. Okay, I'm going to move on. So So this is along the same lines. Where's the friction? The management, and now we're getting, it's almost like poetry in motion here. The management strategies that work for old centralized monolithic platforms are less effective in the newer world of distributed systems and cloud. Tech is leading the way. Like that, really my reason for giving this talk is like, I believe that software developers are the leaders of the future. Software developers have to step into product management roles. They have to step into architecture roles, and maybe even as far as like the CEO, because like the whole ecosystem is changing, and we as technologists have the right perspective to see where the value proposition lies, and so yeah, so that's kind of. But that's kind of like my message. Be the change. Like we have to be the business leaders of the future. We have to start talking value proposition. That's kind of what I've been doing, and it's taken a long time, and people don't listen, but it takes some time, and then they actually do listen. All right, so I see some activity here. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is preachy. This is great. Yeah, and so I'm going to get to, I want to get to what I think is a good part. I've read over the years, we've talked about autonomous teams. This, when you go from the old top-down command and control centralized paradigm to the idea of autonomous teams, terrifying, especially if you're a middle manager with a cushy salary in one of those management paradigms. And so this is why change is hard. Organizations, especially legacy organizations, are riddled with people who haven't kept up, and it's really about like learning the cloud, learning new approaches for efficiency. So yeah, I'm gonna go move fast. So platform strategy, I talked a little bit about this earlier. And so the term platform is thrown around loosely. Amazon talked about, basically Amazon was a platform for producers of books to find consumers at scale. And it worked really well because books weren't perishable, and that was a perfect use case. Then it went on to other retail items that weren't perishable and worked really well. But I'm pretty convinced that, and by talking to lots of people and being an API evangelist, that in 2002, when Bezos sent that mandate out, and you needed a server within Amazon, you had to make a request via an API. That's really when AWS was created. Back then, when he was allocating the compute resources for Amazon itself. And so they ate their own dog food, and eventually that became AWS. Culture is like, so this is another talk. I've read a lot about culture, some highlights here from like, if you get a chance to take a look at the Netflix culture slides. This is all about like the notion of autonomous teams, and this slide deck addresses some things that are really important. Highly aligned, loosely coupled, no brilliant assholes. Yeah, and that's in there word for word. Freedom and responsibility culture. So this is like the beginning of ending the top-down command and control team and aligning responsible people in a way that actually accelerates growth and performance, like eliminating a lot of the management burden from the past that wasn't productive, and just hiring really good talent and letting them go.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hear that.
What was that?
Did I say that?
Yeah,
Is
you
it,
said it's cool.
my mic's on? Oh.
Yeah, it is, but it's cool.
Okay. Well, anyway, I was typing everything, but
Yeah.
I just said you were brilliant. You know what? When I worked at Microsoft, we had one guy who knew everything about our department and how it worked and so forth. a week after we put him in charge, everything continued to go downhill.
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
and that's what,
exactly.
and I hear people at Google saying, well, they let me do what I want, which I thought was interesting. And I guess if you said I'll get good people and let them knowing what their constraints are.
Yep.
And then I got to ask you another question that happened to me at HP. I used to talk to my manager who came in from Belgium. I didn't know my microphone was on. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I wanted questions.
But he said, we're having beer. And so he's talking. He says, yeah, they fly me in. I'm here like 4 to 6 months and they go back home. And he was saying a lot of times as a manager, which is what he was learning to be a manager from a tech guru, basically. He says a lot of times he knew the answer to the problem, but he wouldn't tell. But he would like, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but he says people would get better and like within 2 years they're gonna get promoted.
Yeah, that's great management actually. Yeah,
I thought that was very interesting though.
Yep. It's not about being right all the time. It's about scale. Like, how do you enable people to grow? And so that's a huge part of it.
I do software programming for little scientific programs, but I don't know how to work in a group. I've never worked in a group before. As far as you got some, and then the other thing I was going to ask you about was, I see nightmare stories of people who said we should have never done microservices. Or what a nightmare it is to go from a monolithic application and trying to get that into microservices.
Yeah, so you're getting into my next couple of slides.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's great. It's perfect. And I don't think there's a silver bullet, but like, I'm a believer in microservices. Like the success stories, it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but I think that the concept that I described earlier, like breaking the monolith and creating autonomous teams that aren't dependent on outside teams, is the most important thing. But let me actually cover the rest of my slides, and then I'll take some questions at the end. Thanks for your question. Great comments. And so the notion, so the business is, in my experience, and I shouldn't say this as like a proclamation that's true everywhere. Business always wants to go faster, and so for those of you who are DevOps fans, I'm thinking of Rob Tompkins and other friends of mine. I go back to the Google 2019 State of DevOps paper. This, Phil Kim and Jez Humble, all kinds of badasses in the industry contributed to this paper, and they concluded that 4 key metrics help to improve on speed and quality for a given application, and those are deployment frequency, lead time for changes, change fail rate, and time to restore. But if you notice, the description for each of those 4 metrics starts out with for the application or service you work on. So this is not a DevOps conversation. This is the idea that what is the application you work on? Like, is it the channel? Is it the back end? Is it the front end, or is it the horizontal structure?
I have to say one thing about that. When you're at Microsoft, I'm not Microsoft. When you're at Apple,
Yep.
You don't know what you're working on. You don't know the big picture, and they make sure you don't. So you got to watch out for that too.
Yeah. So maybe some of this is domain or context specific. This is kind of my experience in financial services. I used to only say it was Capital One, but as a consultant, I've seen other banks and I've seen the same challenge. And so what ends up happening, like when the channels operate independently as almost entities in their own right, and you're building features in channels, you end up building sort of like redundant customer servicing applications. And so the application would be the phone, even though you might be doing the same thing as agent web and mobile. The application is the phone. It's the horizontal structure. One of my favorite, I didn't actually give him credit, but Jonas Bonner from Lightstream gave a talk on microservices, and he talks about bulkheading, same concept from the shipping industry, but the idea is to isolate the things. And in ships, like the concept of bulkheading was like, hey, if you take some damage to the ship, the whole ship won't sink. The bulkhead actually isolates the water that you take in, and you can still get to your destination. For those of us who've worked in big enterprises, we've known about services or applications that can take the whole ship down. This is common in enterprise software, I think. And so APIs and organizational design, like, to me, this picture tells a story. And this is like a transition into like, hey, what if the applications look more like that? And what if the application isn't the channel, but it's the thing you do? Maybe it's like, hey, you're in, regardless of which channel you are, maybe it is get basic account information, get transactions, make a payment, transfer money, all of basic banking applications that could be done theoretically across channels. This is kind of a view for the vertical slicing that needs to happen in an organization if we want to standardize services and sort of gain scale. This is brutally hard to do. I'm just saying. Let me see what people are saying.
If I may on this one also, Art,
Sure.
Try to stay concise. This is just, architecture strategy. So when you're building any product, and you consider it as a product, even before product management as a label was a hype, and anybody building anything, if you don't have a team as a whole accountable for the architecture, and especially when a team is working with other teams, and that's what you talked about earlier, which is platforms, you cannot build anything sustainable / scalable. Both terms overlap if you don't think about the architecture of how you will be able to build components or features or value units, but also the architecture of how you will be able to deliver, maintain, operate that service. So it gets much more complicated, and what you're showing here on this slide might look like just French fries vertically displayed, but it has incredible impact on the whole life cycle of whatever you're building.
Exactly, especially when you harden these things and you get to a place where you can automate a lot of it, like it has massive implications for the scale of the organization.
Will you be talking about CI/CO channels as far as updating updating production without having to take it down and make corrections? I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
You were talking. I mean, you were talking about deployment and then maintenance, and that gets into CI/CO channels, I think.
Yeah. I'm not going to talk extensively about that today, but absolutely. Did you want to make a comment about that?
As I said, I'm more of a not having worked in a group yet or gotten to a production wide, and I need to know more about it myself. So,
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to sort of share some stuff offline. But yeah, that's not something I was planning to cover tonight.
That's okay.
Cool. Okay, let me march on a couple more slides. Okay, domain APIs and federated teams. And so this is, I don't know if you guys have heard of like data mesh and things like that, but like as you decentralize, like the monolith is sort of like an architectural result of how organizations are structured, in my opinion. As you start to break up the organization and federate teams to own and support APIs over time, you start to shrink the blast radius of failures and isolate things that cause problems across domains. Teams can also, getting into what we were talking about, teams can automate and harden, sorry for my typos, services to reduce the risk of failures. This was like a big part of like the Bezos mandate. Like, you had to make your APIs externalizable. So you had to have, you had to harden them. You had to be prepared for scenarios where there's outages, et cetera, et cetera. But at the intersection of a channel and API, all kinds of value can be generated and captured in a standardized way. Data engineering, business rules, automation, data modeling, not to mention all the things we just talked about before. And this is, again, getting into sort of like management strategies, outcomes versus output. Like this is a big thing. Like I'm seeing it in startups, in some management strategies, like when you have like Netflix, when you have autonomous teams that can that are tightly aligned, loosely coupled, you start to focus on outcomes. Like a lot of legacy organizations are focused on output. Hey, I did this great thing over here and I did it 20 times, but what's the outcome? What's the business value generated from such a thing? And so pushing business value or goals down to the team level is a huge part of the future, I think, where teams can actually go off and do their own testing and experimentation, create their own hypothesis. As you start to instrument your features better, you start to understand what the customer wants. It's getting back to the working back from the customer. What does the customer want? What are we seeing? Is there friction in my experience? And again, on the last bullet, as the future moves faster, it's the responsibility of those who understand technology to convey the value proposition of operating in certain ways. This is really hard stuff, but like I think that a certain population from the development world will be stepping into leadership roles in the future. And I encourage that. Some other things that I'm really starting to learn about, ML, machine learning ops and data ops. And just like we have automated pipelines for the development world, machine learning ops, like automating everything involved with machine learning is something that's gaining traction and will continue to gain traction in the future. I'm also learning quite a bit about data mesh, and data mesh is almost like the concept of distributing analytical data down to the team level too, and eliminating sort of like the bottlenecks that ensue when you have a centralized data analytics team. All right, but I think I'm gonna stop. Like, I think that's my last slide. Let me make sure. Yeah, that's my last slide. I can take a few more questions. My throat is starting to get raspy. I think I've talked too much, but this has been great. How about some audible questions so I don't have to?
Hey, I was wondering, what's for web APIs, what's the best sort of web frameworks to make them with?
I don't know. Maybe I can defer to Sujith, like on a question like that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of answers here. So I think there's really no single silver bullet, right? Like, so it depends on, usually it depends on what the team or a company has, or organization department has selected as their platform of choice, right? So you go to some shops, they use Python, then within Python, they're either going to use Django or Flask, right? So most enterprise shops are usually like Java or Spring or .NET, so so I don't really think it really matters. All the stacks and all the frameworks within those stacks will provide you what you need. Usually it's more around other things, right? Like, so what is the rest of your company doing? What are you comfortable with, right? Like, so personally, like, I like certain frameworks, not because the frameworks are awesome. They are, but it's more because I'm comfortable with the language, right? So like so if I have a choice, I pick certain ones, but that's pure personal preference based on my level of comfort.
How does that play out with functional programming, where you're not so much dealing with the OS or the hardware, but you're just dealing with the function that does?
Functional. I don't want to get too, and I'm definitely not the expert on that, but functional programming, I tend to see it more as a style of programming. And I know it's technically a paradigm, but It's just a style, right? So you can use the different languages or the frameworks that support functional programming, and they also support API frameworks. Then you can combine those. So it's just a style, and some people like functional programming, and it has definitely become more popular as of the last few years. But yeah, again, I tend to see it more as orthogonal to getting to that space.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to chime in about that?
I agree that it's really more of a way you structure your code versus a larger language level thing, because you can functional program in a bunch of different languages, just like you can do object-oriented programming in a lot of different languages. Or I hope none of you are doing monolithic programs, but those are still possible in almost any language.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it definitely is, again, a matter of style. And also, again, it goes back to the other thing, culture around your development team, right? So you were asking earlier about what is it like to program as a team, in a team, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Right. So there are like multiple levels there, right? So one thing is you are still doing your work, but you are just part of a team. So in an agile or a Scrum framework, you would take a story or a task from the board, and you just go and do it yourself. But then your peers would do code reviews or provide feedback and stuff like that. Then there is the pair programming, which is where you sit with another developer and both of you are working on the same task. You take turns, like switching between the keyboard between or the code. So that would be one way of doing it. That's considered pair programming. And then there's also the newer concept of mob programming, which is the whole team sits together and you have a driver and a navigator, and then those roles switch between each of the team members.
Are the people that do the development also the people that do the maintenance?
Typically, it is the case, at least nowadays, that's increasingly becoming common, right? Like, so you have to eat your dog food. So that you, so if your service goes down at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, you have to be the one who gets called. So next time around, you're going to make sure that doesn't happen. Anybody else wants to chime in on those questions?
Last one thing, it's still very rare to see that in big organizations for obvious reasons. They tend to do metrics organization, but that's the way things have been shifting for 2 decades, especially as DevOps has become very, very mainstream. And the reason for that is partly psychological, but also partly for supporting flow of work. Psychological is because if developers don't have ownership for, like I said, eating their own dog food, well, you're gonna notice suddenly a huge increase in the number of bugs and incidents. But when they have to deal with that later, anyways, well, you're gonna notice that there's a sudden trend to reduce technical debt because, well, I won't do it today. I won't take time to do it, but I'm gonna have to solve that issue and extinguish some fires later, and I don't want to have to do that on my weekend. So I'm gonna work well with the guys from testing, QA, and the guys from ops, to make sure that doesn't happen. So when it happens, it just, it was not planned. I mean, we did what we could.
And another thing that's also important is like, and I think that's kind of truing back to the customer. And I think redundant services is one thing, but even completely building the wrong thing, right? Like, so I think a lot of times I've seen like well-meaning product, product engineers like build something that's completely not resonating with the customer. And I think that's where, if you have the luxury of doing it, you kind of test and learn as you're building stuff, right? Like the MVP concept, right? So you kind of say, okay, what is the minimum viable product that we can put out into the market so we can get feedback? if it's a customer facing business, or even if it's a B2B type situation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like, and also I've seen really good product. People do research where you just take mocked up applications and put them in front of people to get their reactions and see if there's an emotional reaction one way or the other. Apparently, you know, that works really well. I've actually seen it work well. And so they can get a read on whether something will work or not before you actually code it. So yeah, love all those things.
Yeah, and where it ties back to the kind of architecture strategy is like having an architecture that's flexible and accommodating of being able to change things, right? Like, so that's a difference too from the top-down world of yesteryears. Is even the architecture is flexible or it's at least changeable, right? Like, so
Yeah.
So I one of my projects right now, one of the things is we did our initial API was done using a more static type language. But then as we started using the API, we realized that just the real world concerns did not we needed something more, which was more a dynamically typed language. So we actually just switched the whole API from one language to another so that we could deal with the real world scenarios.
Wow, that's cool.
Of what we were facing. And then we, you know, so, and the other side of it is also like we have actually retired services that
Yeah.
So
and is that the term that you is referred to as evolutionary architecture?
I'm sure that's part of it.
Yeah.
But deprecating services, you know, it's a big part of what the platform evolution, right? Like platform maintenance. It's like,
absolutely.
How many services can we actually kill?
Yeah.
So that we don't have that maintenance overhead or, you know, things going off at 9 a.m. and I mean 3 a.m.
Yeah.
All right, we seem to be losing people. So any last questions, discussions? Really great art. This is really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, this is awesome. I think this is good, and a good discussion and participation by everyone. So,
Hey, Art, I got a question.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think it was a software show 3 years ago. Was Capital One was working with a bank in Poland and had to pull them basically out of the 19th century into the 21st with automatic transactions. I understand that went very well, but I was just wondering if you had wind of that or any were associated with that team.
No, I don't have any context on that particular project. I know that we did a project within the mobile team called Enhanced Transactions, which was really about modernizing the transactions then, but I have no context for Poland.
Yeah, I mean, they were happy. It was just that sounded like I got it from the customer's point of view, but he was saying that you should have wrote a book on that. It was it was amazing.
Yeah. There's so little time to write books.
And
I know we had John Bodner on here.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of fintechs, as you mentioned, Art, earlier, you know, like who are really like innovating in the banking space. And especially, I think, yeah, even in the Richmond area, like there are several new fintechs starting up, challenging the status quo. So
absolutely, yeah.
Interesting to see how those companies do. And
yeah, actually, it's the insurance industry, which is pretty static, and a lot of people are challenging that now. I see.
Yeah, nobody will be spared before it's all over, even healthcare.
Yeah,
healthcare needs a shakeup.
Right. I totally agree with that. I think healthcare is not just the technology side of it, but the business side of it is due for a long overdue for a overhaul.
Well, just to see the front of the Washington Post and New York Times today, it said the amount of debt that people have suffered from healthcare is hundreds of millions of dollars more than they thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it bankrupts more people than anything. Anyway, I've got to go get a bite to eat. So
All
this
right.
this has been great.
No, thank you so much, Art, and thank you everyone for participating.